Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and alcohol coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, alcohol, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance.
Hello there. Welcome back to Bite Size Balance. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that I am about to have with Tabbin Almond. Tabbin is a coach who lives in England and someone who I've gotten to know fairly well over the last couple of years. And we were having a conversation offline one day. She was telling me about a project that she's working on. And I thought, ooh, what a great topic for Bite Size Balance. So Tabbin is currently working on a book that is called The Wellness Conversation We're Not Having. And it's about how businesses and organizations are often now very sort of publicly setting up wellness teams and appointing wellness leaders or wellness ambassadors, but they're failing to address the topic of alcohol and failing to recognize how in many of these cases of employee stress, anxiety, depression, and burnout, alcohol is actually exacerbating those symptoms for the employees. And so we're going to talk about the connection between alcohol and stress and anxiety and depression and burnout, but also about what needs to shift and what some of the real challenges are in starting to include alcohol as part of the employee wellness conversation in a really meaningful way and in a way that doesn't evoke fear and shame on the part of the employees in terms of self-reporting. So this is, again, I think it's an important conversation for everyone to listen to. It's something that I have become very acutely aware of in the work that I do in the corporate wellness world. I rarely get asked to come in and talk about gray area drinking, how to drink less, why it can be so hard to change your relationship with alcohol. Those topics are not topics that I get booked for very often. I get booked constantly around stress management and burnout and how to create more joy in your life and so many other corporate wellness topics, but not the alcohol topic. So I think this is a really important conversation. Without further ado, here's my conversation with my friend and fellow TNM alcohol coach, Tabbin Almond. Hi, Tabbin. How are you this morning?
I'm really good. Thanks, Wendy. How are you?
I'm great. I hear you're just on the mend from the vid.
Oh, I am, yeah. Confined to the house for a few more days. But about. Good to see you.
It's really nice to see you too. So you're coming to us. Where are you in England, Tabbin?
I live in Devon, down in the southwest. Very beautiful, rural, remote spot. Yeah, nice place to live.
Lovely. Okay, so why don't we start, Tabbin? We're going to talk all about this really cool project that I did a little talking about in the introduction. But before we do that, let's talk about your connection to alcohol and alcohol in particular in relation to workplace wellness. Why don't you maybe just start by telling us your story? Take your time.
Sure, yeah. Well, like so many people in the Western world, I grew up in a household where alcohol was normal. Whether it was a happy occasion, a sad occasion, or frankly, if the day of the week ended in Y, alcohol was always involved. And my late mum, God bless her, had really quite a severe problem with alcohol. And that caused me a lot of pain mentally, emotionally. And particularly when I started to develop the same sort of dependence on alcohol that I so resented in her. But, and I'm sure this will be familiar to many people, I kind of squashed down the reality of what was happening and just kept on drinking because everybody around me was drinking. So I managed to surround myself with people who also drank. And so it felt normal, even though I knew deep down that it wasn't. And I drank at university, not particularly excessively, I don't think. And then after I'd left university, during my university time, I lived in France, and irony of ironies, I spent a year living in Cognac and landed up working for one of the cognac houses. So that accelerated my drinking career somewhat. And then I landed up working in advertising in the 1980s. And that's where I really found my drinking boots, I would say. I worked as a media planner and buyer, and that involved socialising with the media owners and being on good terms with the media owners so that they would do you a favour when you needed one, or vice versa, but mostly it was take rather than give. That was a feather in your cap. And so all of the socialising put me in great stead, and my career really took off. But it revolved around alcohol. And I mean, I look back now and I can't believe how I did it, but we would go out for lunch to really nice restaurants, always start off with a gin and tonic or two, have wine with lunch, frequently then move on to the ports, etc. Then I'd go back to the office and spend clients' money buying media space. I mean, it just beggars belief, really, but I did it, and apparently I did it quite well. I did it in a bit of a fug, to be honest, but I guess, again, it's that normalization thing. Everybody else was doing it. And then when it came to the end of the day, I would then go off and we'd go to the pub, and there was a pub literally right outside the advertising agency, and go in there and then, get the tube home, basically drunk, several nights a week. And with the way that young people can somehow manage to sleep it off and be back in the office ready to start all over again the following day. And that went on for a long time. And it wasn't every single day, but it was pretty often. And I had hangovers, but not appalling ones most of the time. There are one or two spectacular ones that stick in my mind. One where, to my shame, I was presented with an award for the worst hangover on a weekend residential course. And I was given this revolting sort of mock gargoyle, which was held in one of the Oxford colleges, and this sort of treasured award was this fake gargoyle, and I was awarded it, and then within a matter of minutes I had to leave the room with it, and I didn't make it out, and I was sick into that gargoyle. I mean, that has to be an absolute low point, but it was kind of like everyone thought it was funny. I mean, I didn't, only because I felt ill, but afterwards, you think, this just isn't right. This I'm not functioning well. And when I think of how impaired my performance was because of alcohol, I wonder that my employers at the time, nobody ever said anything. It was, if anything, it was like, oh, well done, Tabbin, she's a laugh, isn't she? And it really wasn't funny, and it wasn't good. And I definitely wasn't performing to the best of my abilities. And gradually the penny dropped that, this really wasn't serving me at all. And I had spells of not drinking during both pregnancies, and felt so much better and much more sort of like mental clarity. But then once the children were born, I just gradually slipped back into what I was doing before. And cut to a few years later, and we'd left London. My husband and I left London and moved back down here to Devon. And so we were both working sort of freelance and independent. And then I really realised that when I drank, I was nothing like as productive. I didn't get my shit together at all if I had a bad hangover. And the hangovers seemed to be getting a bit worse as well. So I kind of faced up to things. I went to AA to begin with and just hated it. I could not get my head around this whole, hello, my name is Tabbin, I'm an alcoholic. And I may have just been unlucky with the groups that I went to, but there were lots of sort of, people who just come out of prison, and I felt very different to them. I hadn't had that spectacular rock bottom, and I sort of felt that they were almost like telling me to go away and, get a serious problem, girl, and come back. And I thought, I've already got a problem. I don't want to go to the bottom of that pit. I'd rather stop now. So AA just wasn't for me. And that's absolutely not to denigrate it, because I know it works for lots and lots of people, including some really close friends of mine. Just wasn't me. So then I hit on hypnotherapy, which was brilliant until it wasn't. And the story behind that is I was alcohol free and didn't really think about alcohol for 7 years, thanks to hypnotherapy. And during that time, my husband and I had gone through a very, very tough time. He had very serious mental health problems, which eventually we worked out. Well, I worked out, and he sort of confessed is the wrong word, but he agreed was down to the fact that he was actually gay or bisexual, which is kind of a bit of a shock to a marriage, to put it mildly. Unfortunately, in the process of his sort of mental health, he'd run up all sorts of debts. So we had a marriage that was on the rocks and huge debts. He then left, and within 3 months, I was diagnosed with not brain cancer, thank God, breast cancer, and I actually survived all of that still alcohol free. I didn't drink through all of that. But when I had the first lot of surgery, and I went back to the hospital, and they'd tested my lymph nodes, and the surgeon sat me down and said, well, I'm afraid it's not great news. We tested 7 lymph nodes and it was in all 7. And suddenly, this sort of mild case of breast cancer turned out to be anything but, and it got really scary. And they were talking about, having to do bone scans to see if it was in the bones, and, a full body CT scan and all the rest of it. And suddenly it was just like all those horrible films you see. And I just got really, really frightened. I went back home that night with my daughter, my adult daughter, and my brother. And they opened a bottle of wine, and everyone was used to me just not drinking. And I just said, I think I'll have a glass. And it was like, everybody looked at each other, the 3, and nobody said anything. My brother just handed me a glass. And I suspect I probably drank a bottle of wine that night. And it was that drinking to kind of numb out from something really, really painful. But even though I hadn't drunk for 7 years, the genie was out of the bottle.
Can I stop you for 1 second, Tabbin? I'm just curious on that. Had you used it before this point as a numbing agent per se? It sounds like it was mostly a social thing and a tool around work, but was this new for you, or was this just curious because you'd had the 7 years alcohol free with the hypnotherapy?
Yeah, I think looking back on it, it's a really good question, that. I think that what was actually going on was that I started drinking, socially, just because that's what everybody was doing. But I think that the reality was that deep down, I was drinking to numb out from a very deep-seated feeling of not quite fitting in and not quite belonging, not being right somehow. And I think that goes back to having not processed my mum's drinking problem and having a slightly odd upbringing as a result. So I think it was there was a lot of emotional pain there, and I don't mean to be all psychobabbly about it, but I think a lot of us have that, of the sort of just feeling that we're a little bit outside, if you know what I mean. And I think that's really why I was drinking. But it was at a very subconscious level. There was all sorts of just emotional discomfort that I just shoved down and put a lid on, and alcohol was really good at keeping the lid on that. I think I'm not a psychiatrist, but the personal development work I've done since makes me believe that that's what I was doing.
Yeah. Sure, that makes total sense to me. So you started drinking again after the more serious diagnosis of the cancer having to the lymph nodes. And then where did it go from there?
Well, I mean, during the next kind of 10, 11 months, I was having loads of treatment. I had loads more surgery, and then chemo, and then radiotherapy. And I didn't drink excessively during that, because I was, when you're having chemo, you're quite busy throwing up anyway. But I didn't know then that your chances of getting breast cancer are somewhere between 15 and 70% higher if you were a drinker than if you're a non-drinker. So the irony, I mean, I've actually got it on my website, a photograph of me celebrating the end of my treatment, my last day of radiotherapy. And I'm sitting there with a scarf wrapped around my bald head with a glass of Prosecco to celebrate. And that's just, to me now, it's completely nuts, but it just shows, we don't know what we don't know. And I was just fumbling my way through, not really realizing that alcohol was probably making things worse. Definitely making things worse. Once I got through all of my cancer treatment, I kind of got back to normal, if you like, and the alcohol just crept back into my life. And I kept having that, I knew that I could do it. I'd done 7 years alcohol free, and I just couldn't sort of get back the momentum of not drinking. And alcohol still had a kind of some sort of a promise for me. It offered me something, or I felt it did. And it wasn't until I sort of Googled around, am I an alcoholic, like I'm sure lots of other people have done, and eventually came across this Naked Mind, which helped me hugely. And the big difference was that this time I was reprogramming my subconscious myself. I was going through, what are the reasons why I think I like to drink, and what's the science behind that? What's the truth behind it? And then I could reframe those beliefs. And so I've now been alcohol free for coming up for 5 years, and it feels completely different, as it feels like I am fully me, as opposed to having paid somebody to just fiddle with my brain a bit. I'm in control of my brain. And the techniques that I learned, I can apply to all sorts of things, not just alcohol. I can put myself in control. A thought can come into my head, but I don't have to act on it. I can kind of weigh it up, decide whether it serves me or not. And if it doesn't, just push it on by. So it's made a huge difference to me. And that's what led me to becoming a coach, because I just felt this really, really has changed my life in ways that I could not have imagined. So weird as it may sound, I'm really glad that I got the cancer and I had that diagnosis and that horrible conversation in the hospital, because so much good has come out of it, even though it was a bit rough at the time.
Right. Oh, isn't that amazing? Thank you for sharing that. I've heard shorter versions of that before, but never the full story. And of course, you and I did our certification together, so that's where we met. We were in the same class. So you have this super cool thing you're working on, and you raised it in a group business session we were in, and I thought, oh, this is such a great topic, because it's definitely something that's been on my radar as somebody who works in the corporate wellness world, and who never gets asked to speak about alcohol. So can you just explain the idea that you have, and where the genesis of it, and what it is you're trying to do? I did let people know that you're in the process of trying to put a book together, but there's a whole kind of project that goes along with this. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. So the project, my working title is The Wellness Conversation We're Not Having. And basically the premise is that a lot of organizations now are taking employee wellness seriously, and they're setting up really good, far-reaching programs covering lots and lots of different topics and areas of wellness. And so it's very common now to find that employers are offering yoga and meditation and sort of advice on dealing with stress and burnout and the sort of area that you cover. And they're really getting good at it and taking it seriously. But there's one whole area that is completely taboo still, and that is alcohol. And the reason that I link alcohol into the wellness space is partly because, those of us who have any degree of alcohol dependence are unwell, but it affects our mental health. alcohol addiction, in whatever degree, is a mental health issue. And particularly important is the fact that very, very often we're drinking, like I was, to numb some form of anxiety, depression, sadness, or stress. And the irony is, of course, that we're drinking to relieve that, but actually alcohol is making that worse.
Can you talk about that for a moment for people who are listening?
Yeah. So let's take stress, which is very common and a real issue for many, many employers. They're really worried about their employees' stress levels, and they will monitor it. What happens when we drink alcohol, in a nutshell, is we have initially when we drink, we have a release of dopamine, which is a sort of the reward chemical, the pleasurable side, and we get that nice buzz. And even though I don't drink, I'm not going to deny that there is a very pleasant buzz from alcohol for the first 20, 30 minutes. If there wasn't, none of us would ever get addicted to it. So that is great until the alcohol is in our bloodstream, and then the body says, danger, intruder, and releases a counter chemical, if you like, called dianorphin. And dianorphin is a downer, and makes us feel kind of agitated and depressed in and of itself, and actually takes our mood lower than it was before the initial release of dopamine. So, we get a sort of, it's like going downstairs almost. We never get back to where we were. I mean, that would be bad enough, but dianorphin brings a couple of friends to the party, and they are cortisol and adrenaline, and they are the stress hormones. And they are triggered, the release of those hormones is triggered by the release of the dianorphin. So far from relieving stress, when we drink alcohol, we are releasing the stress hormones. So we're actually making it worse. And that's why you probably experienced it. I certainly did on many, many a morning. You wake up at 3, 4 in the morning with your heart racing and sort of sweaty palms and just thinking, oh my God, really panicky after a night's drinking. And that surge of adrenaline and cortisol because of the alcohol that we drank before we went to bed. So that's, and then of course we start having disrupted sleep, and that makes the whole cycle worse. So it gets into a really vicious circle very quickly. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of why this is a wellness issue, and a mental health issue. I'm not saying that all stress, anxiety, and depression are caused by alcohol, but they will never be relieved by it. They will always be made worse by it. Mm-hmm. And I do, my social media feed, get people commenting sometimes, oh, I've got depression and I never drink. Of course, but thank God you don't drink, because it would be even worse if you did. Mm-hmm. It's chemically impossible for alcohol to make stress, anxiety, or depression better.
Yeah.
It's inevitable that it'll make them worse. Yeah. And so from an employer point of view, we would do well. I mean, I'm not an employer anymore. I work for myself, but I was in a large advertising agency. And this was something that was just completely swept under the carpet. And it's a real taboo. Now, in the UK, quite often it's actually in people's contracts that if they are unable to perform their duties due to alcohol or drugs, they may be summarily dismissed. That's what it said in my contract. I wasn't actually aware of that, because nobody really, you would do because you're a lawyer, but most of us don't really read our contracts that carefully. But I don't think many people are really aware of that. But what they are aware of is that if they go to their employer and say, do you know what, I've got a bit of a problem with alcohol, can I have some help? It's kind of career suicide. It's just not a good idea. And people know that they are likely to be branded as unreliable, that they're kind of shining an unwanted spotlight on themselves. And so very often people are going off sick with stress, but nobody's getting to the bottom of what the stress is really caused by. Mm-hmm. I spoke to a lady in this country who's a policewoman, and she actually had a total in 2 different blocks of 12 months off sick for stress, but the stress was actually alcohol. And all she had was 6 counselling sessions from somebody who had no qualifications in dealing with somebody with an alcohol addiction. And yet, you know, the public purse has paid for that lady to be off all that time, and nothing was done to address the real problem. And she, when she did ask for help and sort of said, look, this is what the problem is, she was actually sort of given no further help, but was told, I think you need to take a breathalyzer every morning before you start work. So she was kind of shamed and humiliated by it. And I don't think that her employers were being deliberately unkind. At least I really, really hope not. I think it's just that this isn't understood, because no employer is going to sort of deliberately try to, well, I really hope they're not going to try and shame and humiliate somebody in that way. I think it just needs to be raised, and the taboo is the issue. So we need to work really, really hard to remove that taboo, to make it okay, because this is an everyone problem. Anybody who drinks enough of this stuff that's addictive to humans is going to risk developing a problem with alcohol. But it's not a one-way street. We can come back from it. You and I are examples of that. So I think it's a really, you know, an enlightened employer can actually help their workforce by saying, we understand when you're under stress that you may well turn to alcohol, but please be aware of this and let us offer you some help so that you can find alternative strategies, alternative ways of dealing with stress. And if it's got to such a stage that you actually need some help, we're here to help, rather than to kind of vilify you or humiliate you or show you the door. And I don't know what the employment figures are like for you in Canada, but here in the UK, we've got a massive skills shortage. And so employers showing people the door and then having to try to recruit new people and train them and retain them is a real drain on business. It would be far, far more cost effective for employers to look after the people they've got. And if there are a few people with an alcohol addiction problem, look after them, get them well again. And it will also, I know from those people who I've worked with who have been able to overcome an alcohol problem, if their employer has helped, how loyal are they going to be to that employer?
Yeah.
You know, if an employer treats them as a human being and says, it's okay, we understand, this is just something that can happen, let's get you well again and get you going again. And there's no sort of shame or blame or sort of stalling of their career progression because of it. That's an incredible, loyal employee you've got there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all. I hear all of that, and I see all of that happening in Canada as well in the wellness world. So I think that's a really good summary of what's happening and what's complicated about this. A bunch of things came to mind as you were chatting. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, I've spent a lot of time looking at statistics on return on investment for wellness for companies, and because of course that's motivating to a corporation always. You know, we like to think that there are other factors at play, but definitely the bottom line is always going to be a big one. So being able to show a company that there is actually a positive financial upside to investing in meaningful corporate wellness is something that, you know, I spend time researching and staying on top of.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, one of the things that I see in the discussion of return on investment is the productivity levels of an employee. So yes, of course, it costs an employer money if an employee has to leave, because now they need to go through the expense and cost and time of recruiting and retraining and all of that. But also there's a diminished capacity for productivity and increase in sick days and all of that if you've got an employee who's not being supported, who has a wellness issue. So I was thinking about it as you were chatting about how you were thinking back to your story about how you were working for so many years at a diminished capacity, but it was just seen as totally acceptable and normal.
Yeah.
And I wonder, if that's part of this conversation that needs to start happening too. It's because yes, you will have employees who are in need of very probably acute, immediate support and treatment. But you and I, of course, also live in this world of gray area drinking and the alcohol use disorder spectrum. And you're going to have lots of employees who are drinking in a way that doesn't prevent them from working, doesn't necessarily require them to take chunks of time off of work, but does require significant support and maybe a little bit of time off work. And that is leading to a diminished capacity on their part to actually work and produce, right? So
yeah.
We talked about that was a long question, but do you understand?
I do indeed. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Wendy. I think that there is, it's all a sort of on a spectrum, and the alcoholism, if you like to use that word, which I don't, but that it is progressive. Nobody is addicted with their first drink, and the gradual increase in somebody's drinking means that it's kind of like it's on a seesaw, isn't it? The more they're drinking, the less they're productive, and as the drinking becomes more routine, certainly if I think of throughout my advertising career, there was just a diminished ability to perform the job, frankly. I think that the low-level hangovers that we have in our early 20s that gradually turn into more frequent hangovers, that gradually turn into days off work sick or pretending to be sick when actually it's a hangover. It's a progressive thing, but certainly speaking personally, I was not giving of my best at all due to alcohol. And it affected me not just in my ability to perform my job and perform my duties, but also it kind of curtailed my ambition. I was sort of kind of a bit lackluster, if you know what I mean. I was sort of like coasting rather than building a career. And I have no doubt that I could have achieved a lot more in my career if I had put aside the booze and boosted my confidence. That the two for me were interconnected, because I was drinking to kind of mask the fact that I felt like a bit of an outsider and didn't really belong. And actually, as I now know, I do belong and I've got a perfect right to be here. And if I had known that and believed that and chosen not to drink, I could have achieved so much more than I did. And it's a bit, there's a series of like little sliding doors, if you like, and I kept, going down the alcohol one rather than the career one. There's, you can't rewrite history, but I definitely know that alcohol held me back. And closed doors in my life, which I can regret on one level, but it's also taught me an awful lot. And I think that experience and that realization has put me in a very good state to help other people with sort of empathy and compassion, because I know what that feels like and I can see what it did to me. It also makes me really grateful that I didn't have any real disasters. I could easily have been done for drink driving. There were times where I drove when I was over the limit. I could easily have really offended people, and I don't believe I did. Hope not. But it's more the missed opportunities, I think, for me personally.
Yeah. And in terms of this workplace conversation, this area of workplace wellness, I'm wondering what might have been different for you, and because it feels to me like a piece of this, the solution to this, which we're going to talk about in a second, must be in normalizing the conversation around drinking and just making it less taboo and removing some of the stigma about it, even talking about the fact that this is directly connected to wellness. It is an aspect of mental health. And I wonder what if you look back on that time, what might have been different for you if people were actually talking about this?
Oh, for sure. It would have made a massive difference. I think also that and I know some industries are way ahead of the advertising industry, but the office Christmas party was a really drunken affair. And people, this whole concept of preloading and arriving at that party drunk and then on a mission to, the booze was free and it was like, I want to get my money's worth. I mean, it's just and that carried on. I mean, I haven't been to an agency Christmas party since COVID, but pre-COVID, that was still happening. And I think employers have it sounds a bit sort of holier than now, but I think they have a duty of care towards their employees. I don't think it's acceptable to just allow people who don't necessarily drink that often to just have as much free booze as you like, because it's, you're sending a really bad message. And, the sort of jokes about, oh, who was the worst hungover and things like that. And sort of kind of making a hero out of the worst hangover of the morning after the night before. It's just not a good look at all. And it's just, I think employers can really, really play their part there. What I would love to see is, I'm not saying nobody should be allowed a drink, but maybe give people vouchers and let them have the first couple of drinks, can be alcoholic. And then once you've run out of your vouchers, after that, you pay for alcohol, but non-alcoholic drinks are free.
Yeah, I love that.
A really good model. Because, what we're doing as employers is otherwise sort of unofficially glorifying alcohol and putting it on a pedestal, which is not where it should be. So I don't think employers should be the sort of the fun police and stopping anybody having any fun. And there are plenty of people who drink infrequently and don't have a problem, but employers have a duty of care to the people who are starting to develop a problem.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I was thinking as you were talking, one of the ways to do that as an employer, if you're listening and you're involved in planning events for your organization in some way, I think making a conscious effort to have the event or celebration centered on an activity that is not an alcohol-centric activity can be really helpful. So planning something that's really fun and engaging for employees, but that isn't something that you would naturally drink a lot of alcohol doing, or changing the time, right? I mean, although I have to say, I remember we used to have a Christmas luncheon at my law office, and it was always a complete booze fest as well. So I'm not sure the timing maybe would make as much of a difference as I'd like to think it would, but there are ways to structure these parties and celebrations where alcohol is just less of a focus, and you are, if you make the event fun and interesting, and there are all kinds of activities and things happening for people to engage in that they don't need alcohol to enjoy, that can help.
Yeah. I think that's really, really true. Just, and to, from an employer's point of view, the point of any gathering like that is to acknowledge your staff, give them a good time, help them to build relationships with each other that are, go beyond just sort of working in a team. And so there are so many other things you can do. My last agency, before I resigned and did this, we had all sorts of things. We would have wellness Wednesdays, and we were encouraged to just get together on I think it was the second Wednesday of every month. We were given the afternoon off and just go and do things, either with your family or with colleagues. And I remember doing sort of wet walks on Dartmoor, but with a small group of people who I didn't necessarily know that well, but really, really got to know. And alcohol had no role to play in that, but it was a very good bonding exercise. And so that, with a bit of imagination, you can do all sorts of things that don't revolve around alcohol. And the other thing to bear in mind is that, from a inclusivity perspective, younger people, who are just graduating from university and joining the workplace now, they drink less than we did. Yeah. There are religious groups who drink nothing. So, having an event that sort of is built around alcohol is actually excluding those people. So employers need to think about that as well.
Yeah. And also, like, just tapping on that point, I'm just thinking back to my time at the law firm. I mean, some of the people listening to the podcast will know that I struggled to have children, and I was pregnant a lot, and I didn't want people to know I was pregnant, or I had just had a miscarriage and was not drinking as a result of feeling horrid from that, or I was trying to get pregnant and I was not drinking. There are so many reasons why people don't drink that we don't think about. And, I found some of those events to be very challenging as a result. I remember getting a positive pregnancy test back. It was actually my daughter. It was my one pregnancy that took, but I'd had multiple miscarriages and I was terrified. And that night I had to go to a small intimate dinner for work. And my biggest fear, the biggest thing I was grappling with in what should have been like a very joyous moment was how I was going to get through this dinner and not drink and have nobody notice, because I didn't want anyone to know I was pregnant again, because I didn't want to have to tell anybody when I lost the pregnancy. Right. So it's just one little specific example of it, but there are so many different reasons why we don't drink. Maybe we have an increased risk of breast cancer. Maybe we've been through something medically. Maybe women are going through menopause. I mean, you and I are both have things to say about that topic, right? And are trying not to drink because they know it's making their symptoms worse, or it's affecting their sleep, or whatever. They're struggling with another, diagnosed mental health issue, and they've been advised not to drink alcohol, and they don't want to disclose that. It would just be so helpful across the board for us to start thinking about these events that we're planning for employees. And, because that exclusion piece, it's real. And people feel it, and they just don't go to these events. So yeah.
I think you're totally right there. And I think that the fact that we have to explain why we're not drinking is something that needs to change.
Yeah.
And the fact that we need to explain why we're not drinking at a work event is just unacceptable.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is.
We should be actually asking people why they are drinking. And they've got work the next day. It's
well, you and I were both just in a place, I think, I'm not sure if you were there, but someone was talking about hearing a story from somebody who was trying to stop drinking and who had been at a client event out with a client, and the client had said, if you don't drink tonight, I'm not giving you this account. It was like super drastic situation where a person felt pressured to drink, who was trying not to drink at work. I mean, that's obviously not an employer issue, but it is an employment issue around drinking. So I think it's really about starting to talk about this more, which is why I was so delighted to have you come on and talk about this topic, and in the employment context, how do we get this conversation going? How do we start normalizing this conversation in the wellness sphere so that it feels like something is totally acceptable to offer workshops on, to offer, support around, and employees feel more comfortable going to an HR person or their supervisor and saying, look, you know what? I noticed I've been drinking more than I was before the pandemic, and I'd like to change it, but I don't know where to start. And, how do we start doing that, normalizing this conversation?
Well, I think we've got two examples where we can learn a lot. One is the whole topic of mental health, which was a taboo. Nobody would talk about stress, and it used to be occasionally somebody's had a mental breakdown and they've disappeared for a while and they come back. So we've got mental health as one, and then, not unrelated, the menopause as another. Those were both taboo areas, things that we never talked about. And they have both been able to get onto the agenda. So there is a pathway that we can follow. Now, the fact that alcohol kind of ties into both actually is a gift for us, I think. I think it's just a matter of education. I mean, whenever I explain to somebody the connection between stress, anxiety, depression, and alcohol, and that go through the science, it's kind of like a light bulb moment.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's just a message that needs to go out time and time and time again, just so that people, when they reach for that glass to, at the end of the day, oh my God, I've had a hard day, I need to unwind. And, well, wait a minute, this doesn't work, does it? oh, shall I find a different way?
Yeah.
So I think that is, it's an education thing. And speaking to companies, just, as getting this topic as part of the wellness agenda is really, really important. Now, there is a barrier, I believe, which is that in many, many cases, the people at the top of the organisation often are fairly heavy drinkers themselves. And it feels, for them, it can feel, I'd rather we just kept sweeping this under the rug, because I don't really want to shine a spotlight on it, because then people might start looking at what I drink. And generally, this is a generalization, but an awful lot of people who are senior in business have got there through a lot of networking, and networking has tended historically to involve alcohol. So there is a fair degree of alcohol dependence at the top of industry, business, commerce, organizations. So to really break through, I think it would be really helpful to get some examples of people at the top of business who used to drink and now don't, coming out, if you like, and just saying, yeah, I used to have a problem. I'm not ashamed of it. It doesn't make me a bad person. In fact, I think I'm a really good, strong person for having identified that something was holding me back and sorted it out. The number of times that people, when I say I don't drink and what I do, people say, oh, I didn't know you were an alcoholic. And I always say, well, I don't know if I was or I wasn't. All I know is that alcohol was not serving me and wasn't making me happy. And they will go, oh, that's really brave of you. But it's not brave, because I don't see that there's anything to be ashamed about in it. And if we could spread that message, it just needs more people saying, do you know what? This is nothing to be ashamed of. All that's happened is you've developed an addiction to an addictive substance. End of. And that is, as I said before, it's not a one-way street. You can turn around and go the other way. So I think some people just being a little bit braver in order to pay it forward would be really, really good. So if anybody's listening to this who used to drink and doesn't now, I would love to hear from you. And if you are prepared to sort of go public and to help us to kind of burst this bubble, that would be fantastic. But I'd also love to hear from people who have had experiences, good or bad, in the workplace where you have maybe wanted some help but not dared ask for it, or maybe asked for it and either got it and it was really helpful, or asked for it and you didn't really get it. Because I am putting, I've got a synopsis already and talking to agents about a book on this subject to really try and kind of speed up the rate of progress on this, because it's something where we're doing employers and employees a disservice by allowing this to carry on. It needs to change, and the longer it carries on, the more lives are blighted by alcohol, and the more careers are blighted, and the more businesses are held back. So I'm really, you can probably tell, I'm really passionate about just trying to change this.
Yeah, I love that. So I'll put Tabbin's contact information in the show notes, her email and her website, so that you can get in touch with her if you have a story. And you're not just, you're taking some anonymous stories as well, right, Tabbin? It doesn't necessarily need to be public. Yeah.
It doesn't need to be public, and particularly the bad and unhappy ones. I'm sure people will want to keep them anonymous, which is obviously absolutely fine. Any conversations or emails remain completely confidential. I wouldn't identify anybody without their explicit permission. I'm trying to build a picture of how bad it is, and I have to say, sadly, I have heard some horror stories. I've also heard some really good ones, though. So what I'd like to do is to get the good ones as well, so that we can kind of build a blueprint for how should employers do this.
Yeah, such a great idea. This is why I was so excited about this project. It's just such a needed thing. And I know, Tabbin, I've just, through the course of the work that I've done, talked to a lot of HR people in human resources at companies who are struggling with alcohol because it feels like there aren't very many options for support. The options that are available for support for employees feel quite drastic, either rehab, inpatient or outpatient rehab, which usually involves a chunk of time for people,
Sure.
or Alcoholics Anonymous seem to be really the only, they feel like those are the only two avenues for people. And they are often talking to people for whom those don't feel like the employee doesn't feel like those are a good fit, or they're at a point where that's going to be helpful, or, it just feels totally scary and overwhelming. And the HR people are struggling with what else they can offer. And so I think that's probably a part of this conversation that has to happen too. And hopefully in your collection of these stories, you will collect some really great creative solutions and ideas that are happening in companies to help employees, no matter where they are on the alcohol use disorder spectrum in terms of supports.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that at the moment, what tends very often to happen is that HR actually lay this all off on some form of either occupational health or employee assistance program. And it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind. And very, very often, sadly, what those employee assistance programs are offering is substandard. They don't appear to be very expert, and they will typically just, as you say, refer, if the problem is really severe, rehab, which is a really, really expensive option, and tends not to have a very high success rate, in that I hate the word, but the relapse rate is quite high. If you lock somebody away for a month or 6 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever, without alcohol, they'll probably emerge alcohol free. But unless you've really, really addressed the underlying issues, the chances are that they will go back to drinking. So what we're talking about is helping people to understand why it is they drink, what those beliefs are, and reframe them so that they don't want to drink anymore. Right. And that process can start much, much earlier. If people are aware that there is an alternative and that they don't have to be a, quotes, alcoholic to start to turn things around, then we can help people much earlier in the process and avoid a lot of pain for people.
Yeah. I think it must come down to accessible topics. And as you've been talking, I think that's such a brilliant idea to propose topics to corporations where alcohol is not the primary focus. So you're coming in with an angle around an existing, accepted, non-stigmatized area of corporate wellness, employee wellness, and you're just pulling in the alcohol piece, like how drinking less can help manage, improve some of the common symptoms of perimenopause and menopause, or how drinking actually exacerbates anxiety, or how alcohol doesn't help you cope, bringing it into those existing topics that maybe are being discussed more openly in the wellness workplace. Exactly. I love that. Yeah.
Because if you do a lunch and learn within a company of sort of 10 reasons to stop drinking, you'll have a very empty room.
Yeah, nobody wants to go to that. It's not that people don't want to go. It's that people are afraid to go. Yeah, people are afraid to show up because of what that might mean, that they showed up for that session. And so when I'm crafting topics for my corporate wellness stuff, I'm always very careful to try to couch it in the most positive and upbeat and inclusive and non-scary way possible. But I love the two suggestions you gave. I think those are awesome. And I think, you're in England and I'm in Canada. If people want presentations on either of those topics, give either Tabbin or I a call, because we can definitely do that. And I do believe strongly that the place where this really needs to start is kind of grassroots conversations, putting the topic on the agenda in some way and just starting to talk about it. And I also loved what you said about people up at the top and the power of role modeling and vulnerability. And I've seen that play out in corporate wellness. I mean, it's just not very meaningful to people in the kind of working lower ranks, if we call them that, of a company. If the higher ups are not walking the talk, it's very difficult to ask for help, make changes, do the thing. I see that all the time just around stress management, for example, and burnout. It's very hard to not answer set a boundary around not answering emails after 6 p.m. if your boss is constantly firing them off to you at all hours of the night, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
Same thing applies around the drinking piece.
Yeah, I think that, I'm not saying that no boss should drink. Obviously they can, but I know personally several who are sober in their language, who've been through AA or whatever, and people who I've coached who prefer to remain anonymous. And obviously that is fine, but wouldn't it be wonderful if we could break that taboo so that they feel confident and they feel that it's not damaging to their career, and actually it could be career enhancing, right? To say, yeah, used to have a problem, but I don't have one now. And that's where we need to get to. So
yeah, I totally agree with that. I totally agree, Tabbin. It's just so refreshing to me to be having this conversation with you, because it's one that nobody wants to have. And so I appreciate you so much. First of all, I think this is a wonderful project. And if anyone has any stories that they want to share with Tabbin, please go to the show notes of this podcast where I'll have her email, and you can send her a direct note and let her know who you are and start that conversation. I think anyone who can contribute here, HR professionals, employees, CEOs, anyone who has a story to tell, I think that would be helpful on this project. So before we wrap up, Tabbin, just wanted to give you an opportunity to chat about something very cool that you're doing that I happen to know about because I am also your business coach. And that is you are doing some very cool things in the world of alcohol-free retreats. So do you want to a little bit about that?
Yes. So I've got the first retreat is in less than 2 weeks' time, and it's called the Reset Retreat. And the idea, it's a women-only retreat at the moment. I've got a very small venue, and I've felt that most of my clients are women, so I've concentrated on women. I just thought it would kind of upset the dynamic to have men. So sorry, guys, I will organise one for men or a mixed one if there's demand. But the idea is that it's a combination of coaching around alcohol, but also around self-care, self-compassion, self-love. I see alcohol as a form of self-sabotage, and the way of cutting back on the self-sabotage is to increase the self-care, self-love.
Love it.
So we've got some awesome speakers and experiences lined up. So every afternoon during the 5 days of the retreat, we have a different kind of well-being experience. So we've got this incredible vegetarian chef who is going to do a demonstration and a talk. We've got a very, very good author called Sally Page, author of a lovely book called The Keeper of Stories, and she's going to come and do a talk on journaling, which we often talk about when we're coaching as a way of kind of getting to what's really going on in your subconscious. So she'll do a talk about journaling and creative writing, how journaling can kind of unleash your creativity. We have a walk on Dartmoor, which is led by an amazing lady who knows the moor really, really well, and it's going to some of the sort of Bronze Age ruins on Dartmoor, which is quite an experience. We've got 2 ladies coming from the States, so I'm not sure what they're going to make of Dartmoor, but
they're going to love it. Love it. We should have,
so beautiful. Yeah, we
should have said this retreat is taking place close to where Tabbin lives, right? So it's in the south of England. Yeah.
We have yoga, we have meditation, which are both being led by a guy who's a former Buddhist monk, and then we have a lady called Jess Holliday, who's a breathworks specialist, and her session is going to be kind of out of this world. It's a bit mind-blowing, so I've deliberately put that on the last day. And it's all taking place in a really beautiful house that's very, very remote, and it's just us there. Really excited about it. So.
Yeah, it's so great. I'm so excited for you. I know the first one sold out, but that you will be running other ones, and the information about the retreats is accessible on your website as well, right?
Yes, yeah. It's Reset Retreats. Yeah,
perfect. And what's the website address for people listening?
The website address is winetowatercoaching.com.
Perfect. And I will put that in the show notes. So if you'd like more information about Tabbin, or you'd like to contribute to Tabbin's project or start a conversation with her, if you'd like more information about her amazing retreats, which I would die to go to, well, not die, but I would love to go to one of these retreats. Someday you'll see me there. Someday you'll see me there. Then you can go to Tabbin's website, and I will put, as I said, her website and email address in the show notes. Tabbin, thank you so much. This has been such a lovely conversation, so informative, so helpful. And I'm so excited that you're actively doing this work. I think it's so important. And so I congratulate you on that. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a certified Naked Mind coach, I help busy women like you find freedom from alcohol. If you're starting to question your relationship with alcohol, you'll want to listen to my free 3-part video series where I address the top 3 myths around why you think you need to drink. Sign up now at www.wendymccallum.com/myths. That's www.wendymccallum.com/myths.